Without these statements, the Florida AHCA and public cannot detect biases that could affect the integrity of these written products. Yes, it's shocking. I am not President Sunday. Anyway, getting right into this. If you have been staying at my stream at all, you've noticed that I have developed a particular dislike of Ron DeSantis. A couple months back in June, DeSantis put in an order, rather enacted a law to make it more difficult for transgender youth and adults to access gender-affirming care. So by way of background, he was blocked and put it in effect in May and blocked in June. What DeSantis did is he commissioned a study from the Florida Department of Health, which basically said gender-affirming care is speculative and not real. And what ended up happening is it got blocked. But last month, a report was issued out by a number of doctors challenging that assertion, brutally, actually. So I thought I would share with you that report today. So it was stated July 8th, 2022, a critical review of June 2022 Florida Medicaid report on the medical treatment of gender dysphoria. Yes, nothing does say it. The individuals who were contributed to this report is Dr. Meredith McNamara, pediatrics, Yale School of Medicine; Hussein Abdul Latif, professor of pediatrics and pediatric endocrinology. So, you know, people who specialize in endocrines and hormones. Susan Boulware, clinical pediatrics, endocrinology. Rebecca Kamadi, clinical psychology. Laura Cooper, clinical psychology. Christy Oletsky, also clinical psychology. Natalie, I'm not even going to correctly pronounce that at all. Yale Child Study Center and Adolescent Psychology, and Ann Alstott, who is a professor of law. Introduction. On 2nd June 2022, the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration issued a purported scientific report, hereinafter called the 2nd June Report, concluding that standard medical care for gender dysphoria does not meet generally accepted medical standards and is experimental and investigational. We are a group of 7 scientists and a law professor, and we have concluded after careful examination of this June 2nd report that its conclusions are incorrect and scientifically unfounded. The June 2nd report purports to be a review of the scientific and medical evidence, but is in fact fundamentally unscientific. That's a pretty definitive statement as well. And it's I think, telling, because more so than I think most other people, trans individuals require access to care if they want to medically transition that isn't easily available otherwise. So placing these medical roadblocks is ridiculously insidious. We are alarmed that Florida's healthcare agency has adopted a purportedly scientific report that so blatantly violates the basic tenets of scientific inquiry. The report makes false statements and contains glaring errors regarding science, statistical methods, and medicine. Ignoring established science and long-standing authoritative clinical guidance, the report instead relies on biased and discredited sources, including purported expert reports that carry no scientific weight due to a lack of expertise and bias. One of the people that DeSantis consulted for this in a report by the Florida State Health Agency was a dentist. So repeated and fundamental are the errors in the June 2 report that it seems clear that the report is not a serious scientific analysis, but rather a document crafted to serve a political agenda. The AHCA has offered this June 2nd report as justification for a proposed rule that would deny Florida Medicaid coverage for gender dysphoria to people of all ages. We strongly oppose the proposed rule and have documented our reasons in the public comments submitted to the agency on 8 July 2022. This report provides our detailed reasons for concluding the June 2nd report provides no scientific support for Florida's proposed action. The executive summary, let's skip down to the bullet points. Contrary to the June 2nd report, repeated claims medical care for gender dysphoria is supported by robust scientific consensus, meets generally accepted professional medical standards, and is neither experimental nor investigational. The June 2nd report appears to be a scientific report, but its veneer hides a flawed analysis that ignores scientific evidence and relies instead on pseudoscience, particularly purported expert reports that are biased, inexpert, and full of errors. The claimed expert reports are written by authors whose testimony has been disqualified in court and have known ties to anti-LGBTQ advocacy groups. Nothing in the June 2 report calls into question the scientific foundation of standard medical care for gender dysphoria. The report makes unfounded criticisms of robust and well-regarded clinical research and instead cites sources with little or no scientific merit, including journalism, a blog entry, letters to the editor, and opinion pieces. He did, didn't he? The linchpin of the June 2nd report is an analysis by two epidemiologists that claims to undermine the scientific evidence supporting medical care for gender dysphoria. Their analysis is extremely narrow in scope and inexpert, and so flawed that it merits no scientific weight at all. The June report repeatedly and erroneously dismisses solid studies as low quality. If Florida's Medicaid program applied the June 2 reports to all medical procedures equally, it would likely have to deny coverage for a widely used medication like statins, cardioprotective cholesterol-lowering drugs taken by millions of older Americans, and common medical procedures like mammograms and routine surgeries. Beg your pardon here, but who is the author and what is the context? The author is a list of 7 doctors, run back about 5 minutes. I read out their names aloud. The report is a refutation of the Florida Health Agency's report denying gender critical care. Yeah, I can do that. Fine, we'll do it this way. Anyway, while that loads up. All right, let's move on to the analysis section while that loads up. Contrary to the June Second, reports repeated claims medical care for gender dysphoria is supported by a robust scientific consensus and meets generally accepted professional medical standards and is neither experimental nor investigational. That should be the link there. The conclusion that medical treatments for gender dysphoria do not conform to a generally accepted professional medical standards and are experimental and investigational is demonstrably false. Medical care for the treatment of gender dysphoria, which for youth under the age of majority can include lay down. For youth under the age of majority can include hormone agents or puberty blockers, and hormone therapy has been vetted and approved by international bodies of experts based on the scientific evidence. Yeah, I'll fix it in a minute, Ron. Two authoritative bodies of scientists, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health and the Endocrine Society, have published extensive clinical practice guidelines for the treatment of gender dysphoria. These clinical guidelines are based on rigorous structured processes that include a committee of scientific experts and peer review by additional experts. The guidelines are based on careful reviews of the scientific literature and are revised periodically to reflect scientific developments. These long-standing clinical practice guidelines have been used by clinicians for decades. WPATH issued its initial guidelines in 1979 and updated them in 1980, 1981, 1990, 1998, 2001, and 2012. The 8th version remains in process and incorporates systemic literature reviews and ample opportunities for peer review and revision. The original Endocrine Society guidelines were published in 2009 and updated in 2017. Reflecting this scientific and medical consensus, medical care for gender dysphoria has been confirmed as a standard of care by every relevant medical organization in the United States, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychological Association, and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. In 2022, these organizations united with the American Medical Association, the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and other groups to file an amicus brief representing a total of 20 major medical societies. The brief reaffirms that puberty blockers and hormone treatments for gender dysphoria are standard medical care and opposes legal measures that would limit patient access to this standard care. The weight and volume of these endorsements across diverse medical specialties sharply contradicts the June 2nd report's conclusions. Work link work. What I should do is just stick this in the cathedral, and anyone wants to go read it can read it. That'll work. That'll temporarily solve the problem. Point the second. The June report appears to be a scientific report, but its veneer hides a flawed analysis that ignores scientific evidence and relies instead on pseudoscience. The report relies heavily on 5 purported expert documents that are biased, inexpert, and full of errors. The Florida report dismisses or ignores WPATH and Endocrine Society clinical practice guidelines and the science that underlies them, and instead relies on 5 attached documents the report claims constitute clinical and technical expert assessments. Despite their billing as expert reports, the attachments to the June 2nd report are unpublished, non-peer-reviewed documents written by authors with questionable claims to expertise and with red flags for undisclosed author bias. These documents should be given no weight in a serious scientific process. None of the documents attached to this June 2nd report meet the standard criteria for expert scientific investigations, because none is published or peer-reviewed. That would be in a medical journal. Publication and peer review are fundamental to science, as they ensure that a scientist's data and conclusions are open to scrutiny from scientific experts. Florida's own standards for the determination of medical necessity recognize this point when they state that determinations of Medicaid coverage must consult published reports and articles in authoritative medical and scientific literature related to the health service, published in peer-reviewed scientific literature, generally recognized by the relevant medical community or practitioner specialty associations. It is thus both unscientific and a violation of Florida's regulations for the June 2nd report to rely on unpublished documents. Further, all attachments raise red flags for author bias. Yeah, this is a pretty brutal takedown. Normally, academic papers are a lot more circumspect about these things, but like, there's a reason why this got cut down in court already and so quickly. The June 2nd report does not disclose how these experts were identified or what criteria their expertise was assessed. The opacity of the Florida process for identifying experts is particularly troubling because at least 4 of the experts have strong indications of bias. Further, the qualifications and credibility of 2 of the experts have been successfully challenged in litigation. They pulled a blog post, so yes, they did literally pull at least one of these from a website. Two of the experts duplicate word for word or a very slight edits testimony that was offered apparently for pay in litigation. So they pulled expert witnesses' testimony from a trial. The thing about expert witnesses is you basically buy the witness in a court, right? And you pay them, and they say what you want them to say. Both have connections to advocacy organizations that oppose LGBTQ rights across the board. The endorsement of these individuals as Florida's banner experts raises the appearance of bias, that the AHCA sought a preordained outcome and not a true scientific perspective. Adding to these, none of these authors provided a statement of fundings for conflict of interest. This omission violates a strong norm in scientific writing, which requires authors to declare any conflicts of interest. These include professional or financial arrangements that could call into question their independence of judgment. That strong norm also requires authors to disclose whether projects have been funded, and if so, by whom, and whether the authors have engaged in expert testimony. Without these statements, the Florida AHCA and public cannot detect biases that could affect the integrity of these written products. These are more than theoretical concerns. At least 4 of the attachments have notable indicators of conflicts of interest and bias. These are only 4 we examined in detail, and we do not imply that the other one is free from such bias. Why is this link not working for the love? All right, we will worry about that problem later. The author of the document provided as attachment E is Quentin Van Meter, whose history indicates bias and lack of expertise. Although the AHCA presents Van Meter as an expert in medical treatment for gender dysphoria, at least one court barred him from providing expert testimony on the issue. Van Meter is the president of the American College of Pediatricians, which presents itself as a scientific group and might be confused by non-experts with the authoritative American Academy of Pediatrics. The American College of Pediatricians is not a medical board at all, remotely. The ACP is in fact a political group that opposes same-sex marriage, supports mental health providers practicing conversion therapy, and describes childhood gender dysphoria as confusion. Troublingly, the Van Meter attachment proffered by the AHCA as scientific report contains several passages of uncredited verbatim language that appears in a position statement published by the ACP. The Van Meter attachment appears to be a reuse of paid testimony rather than original product. I'm not sure that's the most damning problem with that. This is kind of a neat little trick that you find think tanks doing, is they will pick a name that makes them sound like a legitimate organization. And then they'll turn around and pretend that they are, in fact, an organization with the same weight as an actual legitimate association of scientists. And then these things get picked up by state governments and used to craft legislation. In this particular case, specifically designed to limit people's access to medical care, and medical care that's obviously life-saving. James Cantor's document, presented as attachment D to the report, also faces serious questions about bias and lack of expertise. In a 2022 case, a federal court took a skeptical view of Cantor's purported expertise, noting the court gave Cantor's testimony little weight because he admitted, inter alia, to having no clinical experience in treating gender dysphoria in minors and no experience monitoring patients receiving drug treatments for gender dysphoria. Cantor's document is nearly identical to what appears to be paid testimony in another case, where Cantor's declaration was used to support legislation barring transgender athletes from sports teams. Troublingly, Cantor's appearance in that case seems to have been funded by the Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF, a religious and political organization that opposes legal protections for transgender people in same-sex marriage, and defends the criminalization of sexual activity between partners of the same sex. Isn't this considered fraud? I don't. As far as I could tell, Florida's medical board has a set of guidelines they have to follow, but they're not written into law, so it's not fraud, it's just bad science. And because it's coming from a state agency, it doesn't necessarily carry the same weight. But they get to set the guidelines and regulations anyway, because Medicaid is controlled at a state level, as opposed to Medicare, which is controlled at a federal level. Where Cantor's declaration was used to support legislation barring transgender athletes from sports teams. Troublingly, Cantor's appearance in that case seems to have been funded by the Alliance Defending Freedom. I did that. Because Cantor provides no conflicts of interest disclosure, readers cannot ascertain whether Florida's AHCA also paid for Cantor's report and whether Florida officials were aware that the Cantor report reused his work for apparently the ADF. I don't. On the one hand, I imagine he probably was paid for the testimony, but at the same time, he might not have been on account of the fact that it advances their political goals pretty effectively in Florida. Romina Brigade Peterson is one of the two authors of the document provided as Attachment C. Although Peterson claims to have no research interests in medical care for transgender youth, she has conducted research for the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. Although SEGM claims to be an international medical society, it is actually an activist group that opposes standard medical care for gender dysphoria. There's a lot of money. There's a whole lot of money in being against trans people. I wonder where that's coming from. It is actually an activist group that opposes medical care for gender dysphoria. The SEGM has no publications or conferences and seems to consist solely of a website created by a small group of people with limited or no scientific credentials or clinical experience. The site presents a cherry-picked collection of studies and narrative content that is full of scientific error. So they just basically got together and picked up anecdotes. Well, yeah, it happens a lot, especially because what ends up happening is you get this system wherein each individual state will start fielding all these pieces of legislation. I think it's up to something like 500 this year alone of anti-trans legislation. And each one is going to be put forth by a think tank and done slightly differently, so they can basically bombard courts and see which one sticks, and then rewrite the legislation and do it again. It was a lot of that is what you saw happening with abortion activism or anti-abortion activism. Patrick Lepart, whose document is attached to the June 2nd report as Attachment F, has been disqualified as an expert in a recent federal court decision in North Carolina. The judge found that evidence calls Lepart's bias and reliability into serious question, and noted that Lepart has worked closely with the ADF, again, and has actively lobbied for legal bans on medical care for transgender youth. The judge gave no weight to his testimony about informed consent in that case, finding that it was unsupported by scientific evidence. The judge also found that Lepart has provided the court with no data or methodology used to draw his conclusions that surgical treatment for gender dysphoria has never been generally accepted by the relevant scientific community. The linchpin of the report is the analysis by Briganardello, Peterson, and these people's last names, Jesus. We're coached the BPW document provided as Attachment C, which reports to be a comprehensive review of medical scientific literature for gender dysphoria, but is in fact extremely narrow in scope and so flawed that it merits no scientific weight. The document, unlike the other attachments, is an unpublished, non-peer-reviewed document. Well, it's not. There's a couple groups that really pour money into conservative causes, and they tend to be made up of largely rich individuals. You can buy a whole lot of expert testimony for not a lot of money in the United States. Is it unpublished, non-scientific, peer-reviewed document? Well, think about it. Religious groups aren't taxed. They can effectively pull in donations for whatever they want, not tell you what it's about, and put it out elsewhere. There's not a whole lot of back-end accounting that happens the same way. And political action groups, they get money from anonymous donors and then put it out wherever they want to put it with no real oversight. It's very hard to end up tracing that money specifically because of things like Citizens United. At least here in the United States. I can't say the same for Great Britain. but is in fact written by inexpert authors who construct an arbitrarily truncated sample and adopt a method that violates scientific guidelines and produces a biased result. The authors describe their findings in deceptive language and jargon predictably misled the reader. Our review shows that nothing in the BPW document calls into question the scientific foundations of WPATH and Endocrine Society clinical practice guidelines. The document seems scientific on its face and may be impressive to non-experts because it uses technical jargon and includes numerous tables and charts. But a closer examination shows that it violates established standards for medical research and shows signs of being engineered to produce a preordained and inaccurate result. The false claim that there is no scientific evidence for the base for medical treatment for gender dysphoria. Contrary to authors' claims, there's a large body of reliable scientific literature that supports standard medical treatment for gender dysphoria and spans decades. The bottom line is that contrary to BPW's documents claims, there is a large body of reliable scientific literature that supports standard medical treatment for gender dysphoria. Yeah, Rowling is certainly a very public example, but I imagine that there's enough going on behind the scenes that she's definitely not the only one. The BPW document purports to be a scientific review of medical literature for treatment for gender dysphoria, but the document, like other attachments to the June 2nd report, is not published or peer-reviewed, and its design and execution raise numerous red flags for bias. Here we describe just 4 of the notable defects that undercut entirely the document's claim to objectivity and sound method. First, neither of the BPW authors are experts in medical care for gender dysphoria, as neither are either as researchers or clinicians. One author, Peterson, has not previously studied the subject except for her work in ideological organization, SEGM, noted just above. Her only clinical experience appears to be in dentistry. There's our dentist. The audacity of picking a... All right, we're back. For an endocrinology paper is really incredible. The other author is a junior researcher, a postdoctoral fellow with no prior experience or research or clinical experience in the field. The author's lack of experience renders the BPW work inexpert rather than objective and violates the National Academy of Medicine standards for systemic reviews. By one analogy, one would not rely on, say, 2 dermatologists to conduct a scientific review on neurosurgery and to make recommendations for clinical practices. You're fine. Lay down. Yeah, good boy. Sorry, talking to the dog. Second, not only is the study not formally peer-reviewed, the authors violate scientific norms and standards by failing to engage at all with their peers or actual experts in the subject matter. So they consulted no one. Some of this language in the report is, yeah. Some of them, don't even joke about, yeah. Some of this language is very much repeating, like they're hammering the point home. What? You are fine. He wants to go steal roommate's food. The document has a patina of scientific expertise. It invokes the respected grade standards for rating quality of studies, and it occupies many pages with tables and technical specifications. When the reader looks past the jargon, the authors adopt a method that actually violates the grade standards and appears to be jury-rigged to reach a foregone conclusion. They convey their conclusions in misleading language. This is probably my favorite part. Troublingly, yeah, so the report is saying that it's designed to be is accidental, probably to avoid legal problems, but the implication is that it's very clearly purposeful. Troublingly, the authors also embed in the middle of their document an unjustified decision to limit their analysis to studies published from 2020 to the present, and their project has strong indications that it was a rushed work. They disclose a prioritized study from the last 30 months, 2 full years, plus 4 months into 2022, but they do not defend that priority. The reader is left to wonder whether this truncation served to only help the authors produce their analysis in what was apparently a very short time frame. The truncation of the literature sample to the period from 2020 to early 2022 is worrisome because that period coincides with the worst global public health emergency in generations. The pandemic disrupted many institutions, straining the healthcare system and putting immense pressure on clinicians. It is very likely that the pandemic stalled the production and publication of non-COVID research during this period, calling into sharp questions BPW authors' sampling strategy. The sample is also questionable because authors chose, without justification, a small subsection of databases to search and likely have missed important literature as a result. Specifically, they chose not to source from important databases such as Embase, PsycInfo, Web of Science, Scorpius, and Cochrane. They also limited their scope to works published in English only, an exclusion that can introduce bias. On the one hand, yeah, that sucks, but on the other hand, access to public journals is expensive. So if they weren't actually university researchers, they wouldn't have access to them to begin with. And they probably don't know that these things exist because, again, these are a dentist and a postgrad or a postdoctoral candidate. The authors misused and mechanically applied a well-regarded rating system known as AmStar, which is intended to evaluate methodological strength of systemic reviews. They misused this rating system because of their so-called group of systemic reviews, included documents that cannot correctly be included, practice bulletins, unpublished protocols, and unlocatable documents, thus led to a negative bias. The error is further amplified because the authors used the flawed results of the AmStar phase to inform their next-level analysis grade system, which assesses the quality of medical evidence of pooled systemic reviews. Based on this flawed and purely mechanical review of truncated sources, the BPW analysis reaches the conclusion that there is little or no evidence for the benefits of medical care for gender dysphoria. The analysis is highly deceptive because it dismisses nearly all existing studies of medical treatment for gender dysphoria as low quality, without explaining this is a highly technical term and not natural language condemnation of the studies. Here we go. This should work. Check that one, somebody. See if it pulls up the report. It does not. The key point is that low quality in this context is a technical term and not a condemnation of evidence, because low quality studies regularly guide important aspects of clinical practice. Indeed, the grade system, which BPW document claims to use, specifically notes that grade should not be used to dismiss observational studies or to give absolute priority to RCTs. Yeah, it's 2 links in. I'm going to find the other link. There we go. That does not contain RCTs is low in quality. Had they begun, as they should have, with a literature review of the evidence on puberty blockers and hormones, they would see that the evidence consists primarily of observational studies, for the good reasons listed below. Thus, the 30 pages that it takes the authors to lay out their methodology is misleading. A knowledgeable reader would know that if there is few or no RCTs in literature, then BPW's technical conclusion is foregone, and as importantly, is not a sound guide for clinical recommendations. Yeah, that should be it. Put in simpler terms, if we coded apples as high-quality fruit and bananas as low-quality fruit, then any fruit bowl that has only bananas would predictably be technically coded as low quality. But that technical conclusion conveys very little information without context. For example, if no apples exist, then bananas may be a nutritious choice. It is thus simply a mistake and a mischaracterization of medical research across fields of medicine to conclude that the absence of those reports means there's no evidence for the efficacy of medical treatments for gender dysphoria. Medical research requires instead that researchers evaluate the design and conduct specific observational studies and do so with an awareness of clinical context. We're almost done here, about halfway through. The report reflects a faulty understanding of statistics and medical regulation and scientific research, and repeats discredited claims and engages in speculation and stereotyping without scientific evidence. In its opening words, the June 2nd report makes an error that is repeated throughout the document. Studies presenting the benefits to mental health, including those claiming that services prevent suicide, are either low or very low quality and rely on unreliable methods such as survey and retrospective analyses, both of which are cross-sectional or highly biased. As we document in section 2B above, this is an outright mistake. This is the same mistake they made before about using the term low quality as a non-technical term. Like the BPW document, the June 2nd report thus relies on a deceptive use of technical terminology that is at odds with the standards used in medical research. It simply is not and cannot be the case that all clinical recommendations must be based on RCTs. Many areas of medicine do not lend themselves to ethical or practical RCTs. It is unethical to conduct an RCT when randomizing a patient to a control group that would cause harm by denying treatment of known efficacy. So you can't give placebos to people if the treatment is known to help. It's quite common for the medical community to adopt important consensus clinical practices supported by observational studies alone. For example, observational studies, notably the famous Farmington Heart Study, provided the framework for clinical practice guidelines in prevention and treatment of cardiovascular disease. Yeah, ethical to have a placebo group. So what they do is they put you all under observation. You go to the doctor, you go to your cardiologist, and they take notes over time. They do tests and echocardiograms and all that jazz. So, like, the exclusion of certain data is designed to give a layperson the impression that the data provided thus far is unreliable. It is, in short, intentionally designed to take away treatment options. I'm not going to read the entire thing on the cardiovascular health because that is, you know, not exactly pertinent, but you get the idea. You have multiple ways of conducting scientific studies, and the reason that these are conducted by expert groups and not, you know, dentists conducting studies for endocrinology is because they don't specialize in those things. Which gets back to a point about specialization that's been made on this channel many times before. Thus, the 2 June report not only relies on biased and methodologically flawed evidence, such as the PPW document, it often misuses scientific terminology in an effort to mislead readers to support unwarranted conclusion that medical treatment for gender dysphoria is experimental. The June 2nd report cites sources with little or no scientific credibility. No, Sunday is vacationing, I think? We came up with this plan at midnight. I'm not sure what's happening. The June 2nd report repeatedly cites sources with little or no scientific credibility, including journalism, a student blog, a website, and letters to the editor. None of these things are peer-reviewed. Yeah, no, it would require a significant amount of unethical experimentation. But they don't want to do that experimentation anyway. They just want you to take this information and simply not do the tests at all, which is devastating for people who are seeking this care. Like, it literally can cause people to consider drastic terminal actions. Terms of service is fun. At the same time, the reports make baseless or exaggerated criticisms of solid studies. The report's objections to those studies incorporate mistakes about basic statistics and often misrepresent the aims and findings of studies. Here we offer several examples, but the problem of selective and ungrounded criticism permeates the June 2nd report and further undermines its credibility. I will say thank you to Lakeside Miners on Sunday's behalf. For example, the report attacks a 2015 study by Costa et al., claiming the study design is flawed because it does not include a control group of adolescents without gender dysphoria. The point is simply incorrect. The Costa study was designed to measure the impact of puberty blockers on gender dysphoria. To do so, the authors validly compared outcomes in teens with dysphoria who received treatments with blockers and those who did not. They were able to do this ethically because the control group of teens who received psychotherapy but not puberty blockers were not yet eligible for blockers or were eligible but chose to delay or forgo blockers. The study found that puberty suppression was associated with improvements in psychosocial functioning. So, they're attacking the design of a study, but again, like was said earlier by Gabrielle, is that design that is being proposed as by the report, the June 2nd report, is unethical. The Costa study is, despite the report's claims, a solid methodology. In the context of the study, adding a third control group of teens would serve no scientific purpose. Yeah, because if you have two groups of people with gender dysphoria and a group without gender dysphoria, they don't function. They don't give the same language. You wouldn't treat the group without gender dysphoria for gender dysphoria, so they would add nothing to the study. Further, the report also criticizes Costa for relying heavily on self-assessments, but this is a wildly off-base criticism. Costa et al. Measures psychosocial functioning using a widely used and accepted instrument, the Children's Global Assessment Scale. Psychological research typically relies on such assessments, which are carefully constructed and psychometrically validated. This is one example of the June 2nd report's poor understanding of research in psychology and medicine. Let's be frank, they don't have poor understanding of it. They're deliberately not understanding it so they can come to this conclusion. In addition to these glaring errors, the June 2nd report's criticism of Costa makes an even more fundamental error. The report levels baseless criticisms at a single study and fails to acknowledge that the weight of literature as a whole strongly supports the same results that Costa et al. Reports. Scientific knowledge is important cumulative. It is thus entirely misleading and unscientific to dismiss the effectiveness of puberty blockers by criticizing studies in isolation. Put simply, the report fails to acknowledge the number of solid studies that all find puberty blockers are effective. Indeed, at least 16 studies show that puberty blockers and hormones benefit patients with gender dysphoria, and the benefits have been documented across study designs, including retrospective report, cross-sectional, longitudinal, and qualitative studies. We are, Alice, indeed, the state of Florida, which is something I've been doing a lot lately. If you head over to the pinned link and subscribe, and then you can go check out some of the streams we have done on Florida in the past, specifically talking about Ron DeSantis' efforts to set up his own private army and a whole host of other things. It feels like I read about DeSantis almost every day now, and it's wrong. And we did a pretty in-depth discussion over there on the history standards for social science that Florida just put out, and I think me and Sunday will be doing something along that here in the future when we figure out what we're doing schedule-wise. This brings up another study that they have pulled out of context. The report grossly misleads the reader in a discussion of the study by Chen et al. In 2020. The report cherry picks quotes from Chen et al. To the effect that the effects of pubertal suppression warrant further study, and the full consequences of suppressing puberty are not yet understood. These criticisms are misapplied because the Chen article is not a substantive study of the effects of puberty blockers. Instead, it is a consensus parameter, which is an article that uses a structured methodology to consult experts to develop a research agenda for further studies. So the initial report of intention of the paper they are citing is to come up with a methodology for future studies, as opposed to coming to any conclusions of its own. I think there is a point in going over it, if only to understand the methodology behind which you are being lied to by Republicans. More generally, the study, June 2nd report's misleading characterization of Chen reflects a basic lack of knowledge about scientific research. All research is flawed, including all RCTs. There is simply no perfect study in any area of medicine. The task of the scientist is to be rigorous in assessing what we know and to work to improve knowledge incrementally by conducting additional studies that build on earlier work. That's why the scientific method is taught to kids as a circle, because you have to start over again and do more work. It's iterative. Thus, it's commonplace for authors to conclude that medical research studies by calling for further value of further study that drives scientific inquiry and innovation. Yeah, exactly, Alice. You never let lies go unchallenged. Okay, this was slightly confusing when I first read it because I was really tired. The report also contains a misleading account of the studies by DeSantis et al., not DeSantis. Yeah, Bluestone, I'm going to be going over that later on too. The June 2nd report, not today though, it's going to be a long day as it is. The June 2nd report also contains a misleading account of the study. DeSantis finds that blockers are generally safe and well tolerated in children and adolescents, and that most drug reactions were mild. The report, also misleading and without foundation, cites the piece as raising questions about whether off-labels used to treat psychological condition gender dysphoria is worth the risks. The attribution is bizarre because the report in question actually supports the use of puberty blockers by finding them safe and with only rare side effects, and do not offer any evidence to suggest that the risks are higher in the treatment of gender dysphoria. Well, perhaps it would, but we cannot endorse such actions on YouTube. The June 2nd report notes that the FDA has not approved the use of puberty blockers and hormones for the treatment of gender dysphoria in minors. The report infers that a lack of FDA approval renders a treatment unauthorized and experimental, but this is false. Well, the good news is, Alice, that DeSantis appears to be losing his election efforts rather substantially. So, he's going to go back to screwing up Florida for very long, not very long, because I don't think he's going to go into next year for the Republican primary. He's just getting creamed by Donald Trump right now. In fact, Ron DeSantis is getting so desperate, he's considering getting indicted himself. Which you could probably do over that stunt he did where he shipped off refugees to Martha's Vineyard without telling them. And by abducting those people in the first place, you could probably put him in prison for that. I can't imagine that's legal. He does not technically have to resign as governor to run for president. He's very unlikely. You're very unlikely to win if you are sitting as a senator or a governor prior. I hate when they say we need long-term studies of puberty blockers because, well, more to the point, like what the study is putting out, Jemp, is that we have done long-term studies. There's over 40 years of research being cited here. That's a long time in scientific terms, even in scientific terms. No, he'd have to resign prior to taking office. He cannot hold both He cannot hold both a federal office and a state office, usually, depending on the state constitution in question. But there are 50 of those, and I really don't feel like reading them all. Once again, the June 2nd report is misusing technical language in a way that is likely confusing, deliberately confusing to non-experts. The term off-label has a very specific meaning. A drug is off-label if the FDA has not specifically approved a particular medication for particular use in a specific population. The off-label use of medications for children is quite common and often necessary because an overwhelming number of drugs have no FDA approval instructions for use in pediatric patients. Well, let's be frank. I don't know if you've been watching Ron DeSantis' campaigning much, but he is unnaturally bad at connecting with people. Like that kid the other day who he made a Biden joke to. What does the kid care? Hey, Lisa. What does the kid care? Or he went to New Hampshire, which is a bastion of early politics, and he's like, we're going to go slit throats about talking about the federal bureaucracy. Like, who uses that kind of language for job cuts? Like, there's this aggression that Ron DeSantis has that's just strange. Like, it's not endearing. Like, say what you will about people like Barack Obama or Biden, or even Mitt Romney, and I never liked Mitt Romney, but they all have this ability to connect with a person on a level that's like individual, that makes retail politics work really well. There's an example of Mitt Romney was at someone's house in New Hampshire in 2012, and he was waiting to go do an event, and he cleaned their garage. So like, he swept out their garage while he was waiting. Yeah, it really feels like Ron DeSantis is a parody of Trump's style, which works well for Donald Trump because they expect him to be boisterous and larger than life. Again, it's early. Making election predictions is probably silly. At least till we start hitting next year and start actually having voting, because polls not out this far are ridiculously inaccurate. Yes, I'm being stun locked. I'm going to get back on this. The lack of FDA approval does not imply that the use of medications should be restricted. There is a consensus that off-label use reflects a product of burdensome and expensive regulatory process. Pharmaceutical companies often lack financial incentives to support research required for FDA's approval for specific use in children. So capitalism kind of screws us there, doesn't it? The American Academy of Pediatrics, recognizing these facts, specifically authorizes the off-label use of drugs. The purpose of off-label use is to benefit the individual patient. The practitioners use their professional judgment to determine these uses. As such, the term off-label does not imply an improper, illegal, or contraindicated or investigational use. Therapeutic decision-making must always rely on the best available evidence and importance of the benefit for the individual patient. So yeah, I think that's a really important thing to note. Is there are a lot of off-label uses you can find on drugs. Anyone who has been a guest of the American medical system for any long time, for any chronic illness, is probably very familiar with the use of prednisone. For example, I had to get a number of surgeries done on my hands this year, or my arms rather, to create a dialysis access. And after two of those surgeries, I had lost a significant amount of function in my hand. I don't even know who that is. I lost a significant amount of function in my left hand, and I had to undergo some therapy to get it to work again. But at the same time, the neurologist prescribed prednisone, which is a steroid, and it's also incredibly commonly prescribed for kidney issues in the first place. So like, prednisone is a pretty common drug that's used for a whole bunch of things that aren't necessarily labeled by the FDA. Off-label use is so common in pediatrics that off-label drugs are prescribed in 20% of patient visits. Combined hormonal contraceptives or progesterone-only contraceptive methods, which are approved on label for contraception, are also used off-label to treat heavy menstrual bleeding, which could be due to a bleeding disorder, a delay in normal pubertal maturity, or a variety of other conditions. In other words, they're saying they use birth control for non-birth control purposes all the time, which is something that has been noted by many advocates. Who are opposed to contraceptive banning of contraceptives. Yeah, prednisone is not a fun drug. I won't recommend it. It does not do you any favors for your mood, your physical activity, or anything. However, if the doctor thinks it's important to take medicine as prescribed, disclaimer. Yeah, Benadryl is often used as an over-the-counter sleep aid, although you can develop a resistance to that. Funny story. I had a period of about 2 weeks where I didn't get more than 2 hours of sleep. Not good. In neonatal medicine, off-label medications are routinely used to treat the smallest and most fragile of children. Caffeine is used as an off-label to treat apnea. Coffee and caffeine is like a ridiculously useful thing if you are ADHD, such as myself. Basically, if I don't drink a cup of coffee in the day, early in the morning, my entire day goes off. More routinely, in general pediatric care, I know this drug. Pantoprazole is a proton pump inhibitor used to treat acid reflux. It's Protonix. It's just called Protonix. I don't know why they spell it that way. In neonates with gastro reflux disease who do not respond to traditional first-line treatments, is used successfully to help infants gain adequate weight in the first 4 to 6 months of life. If they do not respond to using different types of bottles, low flow nipples, or more frequent slow flow nipples or more frequent and lower volume feedings. In addiction medicine, routine medications like supplemental nicotine patches are off-label. They are not approved for use in these younger than 18, but are used successfully in vaping smoking cessation, so much so that the AAP has issued guidelines on how to use and dose them. Don't smoke, kids. It's terrible. Finally, the June 2nd report also notes that testosterone is a controlled substance and is subject to risk of abuse, but once again, this is misleading. The inclusion of testosterone on the schedule of controlled substances reflects the misuse of the drug by some individuals and communities, weightlifters and athletes, for example. The classification does not in any way imply that physicians should not dispense the drug if medically necessary. No special license is necessary for prescribing the medication, which is routinely prescribed to cisgender men with testosterone deficiency, as well as the trans masculine patients. The report falsely claims that medical care for gender dysphoria is provided to a large percentage of children who will come to regret their treatment. In fact, patients with gender dysphoria have vanishingly low rates of regret regarding their medical treatment. And I have seen this go back and forth a couple times in discourse about regret rates, particularly around certain, that Ali person who transitioned and then got mad about it, and from the United Kingdom, likes to throw this one around. I want to say Ali Murs, but that's the singer. The June 2nd report attempts to cast doubt on medical treatment for gender dysphoria by repeating the debunked claims that most transgender teens ultimately reject their transgender identity. Below, we analyze 2 related claims made in the report and show why both are refuted by sound evidence. Yeah, Ali London, that's the one. First, the report claims that the majority of young adolescents who exhibit signs of gender dysphoria eventually desist and conform to their natal sex. This is false. We have refuted this claim in detail in prior work, addressing similar claims made to support medical treatment bans in Texas and Alabama. The key point is that adolescents with gender dysphoria rarely find their dysphoria resolves without treatment, because medical treatment for gender dysphoria begins only in adolescence, and only if medically necessary for gender dysphoria. Medical treatment is thus provided only to a group known to be quite stable in their gender identity. In other words, you got to jump through a whole bunch of hoops to even get to the point where you're getting this treatment in the first place. Oh, I don't know anything about that, I try to avoid that particular topic like the plague. The authoritative WPATH and Endocrine Society Clinical Practice Guideline contained measures to ensure medical treatment is administered only when necessary, as part of the process of diagnosis and treatment. Clinicians take care to explain to the youth and their parents the risks and benefits of treatment, as well as the risks and benefits of no medical interventions. Yeah, prednisone is At least that's my understanding, is it's used in chemo to help control certain things. Like prednisone, to be perfectly fair, I have been a kidney disease patient now going on 15 years, 16 years, or give or take. I forgot the math. Anyway, prednisone gets prescribed for virtually everything. The other thing that doctors love to prescribe a lot, that for various treatments, particularly when there is less than a less than clear treatment path, is high dose fish oil, which, by the way, is ridiculously expensive. Second, the June 2nd report claims without citation that roughly 8% of transgender people decide to return to their natal sex for reasons ranging from treatment side effects to more self-exploration that provided insight on the individual's gender dysphoria. This 8% figure is not large, but it nevertheless is an overstatement of the percentages found in scientific literature. Solid studies show very low percentages of regret, typically under 1%. Yeah, even if, yes, there was a coup, Andrew, I'm now in charge. Even if the number was 8%, 8% of the total trans population would be negligible, ultimately. That would still leave 92% of people who would be helping. Indeed. The June 2nd report offers us general evidence for its claims about regret only a 2021 study by Littman. But the Littman study cannot establish how prevalent it is for transgender individuals to reject their transgender identity. Indeed, the Littman study does not even purport to show the percentage of transgender people who detransition. Instead, it simply asked 100 people who self-identified as detransitioners about their reasons. So it's a survey. It's a survey with a sample size of 100 people. That's mind-boggling. Using Littman's study as evidence for widespread regret is akin to saying that giant pandas are common because if we search, we can find 100 of them. Exactly. 100 people is not a large sample size. The survey was anonymous. Participants were solicited from, among other venues, by anti-transgender social media groups. So there's no real evidence if the 100 people Littman found were even actually detransitioners in the first place. Admiral General Daedalus, your Aladdin in me is very Aladdined. Finally, the June 2nd report makes a flagrant error in conflating detransition with regret. In addition, the Littman study is unscientific in describing a very likely diverse group of people as detransitioners. She defines detransition as discontinuing medications, having surgery to reverse the effects of transition, or both. Discontinuing medication would have to be radically different. Like, wouldn't it, by definition, not be the same thing as detransitioning? You're stopping transitioning, you're not undoing it. Look, The Dictator is a ridiculous movie on its face of it, but you should go watch it, just because it's kind of excellent. By contrast, the June 2nd report disregards a very large and far more nuanced and important study by Turbin et al., which shows that transgender people who do not return to live as the sex assigned at birth may not permanently do so, and are, by their own report, influenced largely by external factors, such as pressure from family, non-affirming school environments, and sexual assault. Yeah, as it turns out, if you make people's lives difficult, they tend to stop doing things. Also, especially if you're in the United States, this stuff's expensive. Yeah, some people get to that point, etc., etc. Like, this stuff's expensive, as I understand it. Like, the price for this stuff is like astronomical. I know a good friend of mine started transitioning in 2020, which is like a really difficult time to do that. So I'm very proud of her to make that decision and choose to go through that then more than anything. But like, she's paying a fortune in these drugs. Jesus. I thought the stuff I have to buy is bad. The June 2nd report claims that social factors may be contributing factors to gender dysphoria, citing as evidence a single discredited study by Littman. This is basically trying to argue that this is peer pressure. That causes people to identify as trans. And I'm going to be really frank. If you take a look at the raw numbers about people who identify as LGBTQ in general, you will see that it rapidly increases over the years. There are two huge reasons for this. Two huge reasons for this. The first is the AIDS epidemic in the 80s was devastating to the LGBTQ community. It caused a very sharp decline in population. The second is one of these things that I learned when I was living in Chicago. In fact, where I was living in Chicago was Boys Town. So I got to meet a whole bunch of people, older LGBTQ people, who were very happy to talk to us about their stories about living through the 70s and 80s and 90s. It's simply like, if you wanted to be active in those communities, back then, you basically were a spy. You're like going up to doors, knocking on them and saying secret codes. It was just not openly done. It's a huge change in culture from then to now, especially in the last 13, 14 years. Yes, there's definitely a noticeable lack of older gay men. You don't see that many. You don't meet that many. It was a whole lot of young people in Boys Town when I lived there. A whole lot of, and like a couple older people, but like, and it's a diverse community. I'm obviously cisgender and straight, but no one was particularly upset about having me around, and I hung out at Stella's Diner, talked with people all the time. So like, incredibly welcoming community, great people, fantastic. Nothing ends your prejudice for a group more than living with them is my advice to you. Again, I'm being stun locked. Anyway, moving on. W. Path, among other authorities, has taken a skeptical view of Littman's claim, and the study has been criticized for serious methodological errors, including the use of parent reports instead of clinical data and recruitment of its sample of parents from anti-transgender websites. Yeah. The journal of publication required an extensive correction of the original Littman article because of these misstatements. Such a correction in reputable, peer-reviewed academic journals is only taken when a panel of experts, in retrospect, came to recognize the methodological flaws of the original study and conclude that it would be unscientific to allow the original published findings to stand. Yeah, that doesn't happen often at all in any peer review setting. Almost like corrections are very rare. Corrections where the author itself doesn't correct, it's very rare, because you are under so much pressure when you're publishing to get the thing right the first time. Like, spend some time on history Twitter and you'll find everyone complaining about reviewer number 2. It's just a thing. Also, I'm going to take a hot second to stop shilling. 2 Guys Talking History is 1 subscriber away from 200. Who's going to be the big 200? Yes, exactly. The Littman study appears to have come from a bunch of parents they found on anti-transgender websites. Littman's sensational hypothesis has been widely covered in the press. That's another thing. Scientific press sucks. Like, it will come out with a thing in a headline, policy being driven by sensational headlines. More recently, an April 2022 study of 173 youth presenting at a Canadian gender clinics found no evidence of rapid onset dysphoria or social contagion. The researchers posited that if rapid onset gender dysphoria were a real phenomena, then teens who had recently begun identifying as transgender would, per the Littman hypothesis, also be more likely to report online support and engagement in their gender identity. They might also, per Littman's hypothesis, be more likely to struggle with mental health concerns. Yes, it does make it worse when the papers are paywalled. However, at least for history, what will happen is I will find a paper and it'll be paywalled and has an author, and you can usually reach out to the author and they will send you the paper because they want you to read it. And people, the authors of research papers, make no money from the journals. None. It's all a prestige game. The April 2022 study of 173 youth found no such correlations, strongly undercutting the rapid onset hypothesis endorsed by the June 2nd report. The researchers controlled for age and sex assigned at birth and looked for correlations with recent gender knowledge defined as less than 1 or 2 to 2 years having passed since you realized your gender was different from what other people called you. Sorry, there's lots of stuff happening in the back end over here because it's Sunday's channel and not mine that I've never seen before. Apparently it tells you when ads are heading. Nor was it associated with having gender supportive online friends and general support from online friends or transgender friends. Hey, Lucy. Data does not, substantiate that younger people today are more likely to identify as transgender than are older people, but this does not substantiate the idea of social contagion. Data does substantiate. There we go. Yeah, it's not like this is a new concept. In the 80s, there was a television show that actually did a reasonable job for airing in the 80s. Called Night Court, and what Night Court was a comedy. It's recently been revived. It was a comedy with the magician Harry Anderson, who plays the judge, and then you have John Larroquette. They have an episode where a friend of Dan, John Larroquette's character, an old college friend, comes back, and she has transitioned. She has transitioned since they went to college together. And Dan, who's kind of a pig, no, he's very much a pig, is taken back by this whole thing, and gets, what's the word? She calls it snippy. Gets snippy about it all, and the episode kind of ends on a for the 80s, a fairly progressive note. It's definitely, those are my Windows noises. It ends on a fairly progressive note. It's actually worth going to swag the episode. It's called Dan's Friend, I think. Best of Friends, that's it. Yeah, that was my Windows update doing stupid things because I'm unorganized, let's be perfectly honest. Further, the data does not show a massive waves of transgender identity even among teens. A 2022 study by the Williams Institute found that using an expansive definition of transgender, about 0.5% of adults now identify as transgender, while 1.4% of youth aged 13 or 17 do, or about 300,000 young people. This is not a large percentage or a large absolute number. Underlying the report's claim about social contagion is a set of imagined stereotypes that teenagers do not know their own gender identity and readily change their gender identity based on peer influence and social media, which is really, really reductive to kids who typically have a pretty good grasp of what's going on. Like, they don't necessarily understand everything, but they typically have a very good grasp of, like, what they want in this regard. Like, it wouldn't be out of place to, like would you go to a person and say the converse to a cisgendered kid that they are just going to turn out to be trans later on due to peer pressure? And that's not really what's being said. What they're basically trying to argue is that these kids are an aberration instead of a perfectly normal experience. Well, yeah, that's an excellent point, Sophie. Is like people who are LGBTQ associate with one another a lot. Like these groups tend to bond in really interesting ways. They tend to bond with each other more than anything else. I think the phenomena that I've heard described is as found family. Like this idea of forming groups around who is similar to you and who will support you, and like that's not dissimilar than the way like kids who aren't LGBTQ form groups. They form groups with people who will support them. It's the same behavior, but it's wrapped around identity in a way that seems unusual, but isn't really at all unusual. It like. If you're a kid and you're a theater kid, you hang out with other theater kids. If you play football, you hang out with other football players. That's how communities form, by shared experience. So, like, if you're in a position like you're an LGBTQ kid and you're ostracized, you're going to naturally gravitate to other people like you and form a group together. It's just like, it's weird because they're taking a really basic behavior and trying to make it seem insidious. These stereotypes contradict the scientific understanding of gender identity formation. Studies of so-called conversion or reparative therapy, for example, find that transgender identity is highly resistant to change even in the face of concerted efforts by medical authorities versed in psychological methods. Studies that find conversion therapy is ineffective in altering gender identity and is psychologically damaging. Yeah, gender conversion therapy is terrifying. Like this is torturing kids. Don't do torturing kids. Bad idea. The June 2nd report speculates because a high proportion of youth receiving medical care for gender dysphoria also have a behavioral health disorder. Available research raises questions as to whether the individual's distress is secondary to pre-existing behavioral health disorders and not gender dysphoria. In other words, it is speculating that gender dysphoria is not real, but it's rather an imagined byproduct of underlying mental illness. Again, gender dysphoria, like dysphoria is not uncommon. Not necessarily gender dysphoria, but like, I don't think I've met a single person who hasn't at some point said, I don't like this thing about my body and I'd like to change it. Like, dysphoria is very common in people as a regular everyday thing. First, the report implicitly posits a casual hypothesis that behavioral health disorders cause gender dysphoria. You'd have to research that with a paper. Many papers, actually. The hypothesis is entirely devoid of scientific evidence. Indeed, the evidence strongly suggests that the direction of causation runs the other way. It is well established that being transgender leads to mental health concerns because of the social stress and discrimination of being transgender in a society that is strongly oriented to cisgender identity and disapproving of transgender identity. In our society, transgender individuals experience a great deal of discrimination, hostility, and physical violence. Quite simply, it is unsafe to be transgender in the current hostile climate. That's actually a really powerful statement about priority, too. The accumulation of existential fear and threatening experiences can manifest as physical and mental conditions. Like, no, this is exactly it. You have to think of being transgender or LGBTQ or anything that is not commonly accepted, and it's almost like you're permanently at war. It's almost like you're permanently at war. You're constantly under threat. It's stressful. It messes with your head. In a lot of weird ways. Like, it's not a good way to live. Eventually that stuff catches up to you. Although the effects of gender minority stress are well known, the report makes no mention of the literature. Instead, it indulges in speculation based apparently on the stereotypical of transgender people as confused and dysfunctional. And we are bad as a society about understanding people with mental health issues in the first place. We seem to think that we can punish mental health issues out of people. The June 2nd report posits that individuals with mental health concerns cannot be trusted to understand their own gender, which again seems, this is a highly prejudicial stance, and one that disregards the role of psychologists and psychiatrists who've developed sensitive and effective approaches to treating adolescents with gender dysphoria and mental health concerns. Second, the co-occurrence of psychological distress among individuals with gender dysphoria provides no reason for denying care. Any population of individuals, cisgender or transgender, will include some with mental health concerns. And the WPATH and Endocrine Society guidelines recognize that there is a higher prevalence of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder among transgender youth than among cisgender youth. In response, the guidelines set out practices that include a careful psychological assessment of each adolescent as part of the process for determining whether medical treatment for gender dysphoria is appropriate and likely to have benefits that outweigh the risks. The Endocrine Society guidelines specifically recommend that mental health professionals should be able to diagnose gender dysphoria and distinguish it from other conditions that have similar features. Body dysmorphic disorder, yes. That was what I was getting at. In addition, the mental health provider should be prepared to diagnose psychiatric conditions, provide or refer for treatment, and to psychosocially assess these persons' understanding, mental health, and social conditions that can impact gender-affirming hormone therapy. In our clinical practice, we also ensure that youth and their caregivers have the information and support necessary to fully understand the risks, benefits, and outcomes of treatment. That is, we not only provide assessment, but also fill any gaps in understanding and support to the decision-making process. The degree to which this happens is important. The only experience I have that is comparable is dealing with chronic illness. There's a lot of learning that goes into seeking medical care. It is all very difficult, and having a doctor help you through it that understands and knows what's happening is important. And denying people this care can be incredibly devastating. Third, the June 2nd report implicitly claims that any mental health disorder impairs a minor's ability to provide informed consent and somehow invalidates the informed consent of their guardian. Which would be a standard that's applied, I think, basically nowhere else. Like, in order for me to lose my ability to consent to things, you'd have to go to court and get an order for it. Which, like, you have to get this enforced by law in any other circumstance. Experts in child and adolescent psychiatry, child psychology, and adolescent medicine have established that youth can make complex medical decisions. Yes, you can, for example, as a minor, consent to surgeries. Further, the literature specifically demonstrates that transgender youth with co-occurring mental health conditions can competently participate in decision-making. With guidance from mental health providers, parents, and physicians, teens can be part of the decision process that explore their identity and make nuanced decisions about the benefits and medical risks of treatment. Indeed, these processes of exploration decision-making are central goals of and central tasks for trained mental health providers who work with teens. And like, that's, again, a standard that gets applied to people who aren't seeking gender affirming care. Like, you are assumed to be allowed to have a say with your doctor, like, and you talk with your parents and you do these things regularly. It does not, even if you have other underlying conditions. All right. The June 2nd report speculates without evidence that psychotherapy alone is as effective medical treatment for gender dysphoria. The claim contradicts the findings of solid scientific studies which show that medical care is more effective than psychotherapy alone. Sorry, I had to take care of something there. It reports no actual evidence for the denial of standard medical care. Its recommendation rests instead on an unfounded and mistaken criticism of existing literature. The Cantor document attached to the AHCA report as Appendix C states that several studies successfully identified evidence of mental health improvement due to medical treatment for gender dysphoria, but because patients received psychotherapy along with medical services, which of these treatments caused the improvement is unknowable. The statement is false. Medical treatment for gender dysphoria has been shown to lead to positive effects on mental health that are not associated with psychotherapy alone. Costa et al., the study we cited earlier, in 2015, found that puberty blockers improve psychosocial functioning in teens with gender dysphoria compared to teens who receive psychotherapy but not blockers. Costa's study was designed to include a control group of teens with gender dysphoria who did not receive blockers. In a 2022 study, Tordoff et al. Finds that puberty blockers and hormone therapy are associated with significant improvements in depression and suicidality in a population of transgender and non-binary youth aged 13 to 20. The author showed the independent efforts of medications such as puberty blockers and hormone on depression, anxiety, and gender dysphoria. They controlled for temporal trends and other confounding factors, expressly including whether the teen received ongoing mental health therapy. Put simply, Tordoff et al. Clearly found that youth with gender dysphoria reported better outcomes if they received puberty blockers even after controlling for the effects of psychotherapy. Similarly, in 2020 study, Laura Cooper et al. Found that gender-affirming hormone therapy made a large improvement in adolescents' body-related distress that led to small to moderate improvement in the symptoms and depression of anxiety. Cooper et al. Specifically collected data on psychotherapy and the use of psychiatric medications and expressly controlled for both. Thus, their studies showed that hormone treatment for gender dysphoria is as effective above and beyond the benefits of psychotherapy and psychiatric medications. Too long, didn't read. The Florida study is total bunk. All right, with that, we're going to take a short break, and then I will be back, and we will talk about what a faultist, because he's always fun.